back to my YouTube channel. My name's Katie, I'm a mixed media sketchbook artist, and today I'm going to be talking about a new Royal Talens sketchbook. So if you follow me on Instagram or have seen some of my previous videos, you'll know that the Royal Talens art creation sketchbooks are some of my favourite. I think that they are really reasonably priced. I like the different sizes they come in. This is my most used one, which is 13 by 21 centimetres, but they also do smaller and larger. They do handle quite a lot of media, though they don't handle watercolour very well, but I use all of my mixed media in there and I do find that I go through them quite quickly. One of the only downsides that I find with this sketchbook is that the paper is ivory toned. So the paper you can see here is quite cream and definitely not white. So I've done a few videos on my channel where I've compared sketchbooks. I will leave a link up here so you can see the differences. But I do find that having the ivory tone paper does make the colours of our art supplies look different. Obviously it's not against white, so I do find that they look more vibrant and vivid on white tone paper. One of the biggest pieces of feedback I hear is that people wish it wasn't ivory toned, and I've seen that Royal Talens have brought out a white paper version. So what we're going to do today is test them out. Now on the looks of it, it is the exact same. I've got the 13 by 21 centimetre one, it's 140 GSM and it's 80 sheets. So all in all it should be the same, but obviously the paper is white. So I do think that the paper is going to be different because it's going to be made up of something different just to make it more white. And I'm really keen to see if it takes the same amount of media, how it does with layering, or what the differences are. On a drawing session with my Patreons last month, some of them did say it was very different. So I thought I would put it to the test, put it on YouTube and give you my review. So without further ado, let's do some painting in these sketchbooks. I'm going to do one in the ivory based paper and one in the white tone paper. I'm going to use the same materials but they will be different views and we'll see how we go. So we are starting with our materials. I'm going to be using gouache. I've got my tear off paper palette, my Neocolors, some Derwent Inktense blocks, some pan pastels and a little sponge to apply it, some marker pens which I don't end up using much of, and some coloured pencils. So here are the two sketchbooks. Like I said, they are 13 by 21 centimetre size, and I'm just showing you the differences in colour inside on the pages. So this is the ivory tone version, and then this one is the white tone version. Now I can't seem to find this in other sizes, and it's also really hard to search for because it doesn't have a specific name, but from what I can see the only one that has these white pages is the one with the cork cover. So if you did want to buy this, and I will leave a link in the description, then it's the one with the cork cover that you want. So I am just setting up my desk. I've got all my bits around me and I'm just popping some gouache onto my palette. So I am using the same colour palette for both of the drawings, and I found both of my references from Google Maps. I really enjoy drawing different landscapes and I find Google Maps gives me a really nice variety without me obviously having to travel there. I have done a video all about virtual plein air, travelling via Google Maps and creating art from that on my YouTube channel, so I will leave a link up in the corner if you're interested. So you've seen me paint in this ivory Royal Talens sketchbooks quite a lot. I have shared quite a few process videos on my channel, but I am really pleased with how this turned out. I know that I mentioned about not using wet mediums in the Royal Talens, but I find using gouache, and I do use it reasonably thick, is absolutely fine, and you'll see that when I share the final results as well, because I'm going to show you close-ups if the page buckled and things like that. But you can see I'm not applying loads of water. I am still mixing my colours off of the page, but you can see here where it's still got that painty texture. It does struggle with watercolour, and just having that much water on the page does mean that it warps, and I find that it doesn't layer very well. So personally I prefer using these kind of mediums, so acrylic paint and gouache I find absolutely fine, and I can still use some water. It's not like I can't use water at all in this sketchbook, but you do have to be careful if you are using a lot of water. So here I'm using some pan pastels. Now I find this applies really smoothly, but the difference between this one and the white one, which you'll see later, is the colour. The colour is a lot less vibrant in this one. I'm putting on the Derwent Inktense block here as well, so I've just dipped it in water and that applies fine. So I really like the texture that gives by just placing the block in water and applying it straight to the page. I also added in a tiny bit of brush pen, and now I'm coming in with some Neocolor 2s which I'm using dry. So I do layer on my mediums. I'm using quite a few here because obviously I wanted to try mixed media. I'm not doing like a huge amount of testing. I'm not trying loads of things on top of each other, but I'm just testing it how I would normally use my sketchbook. So I feel like it's a accurate test for how I'm going to fill my sketchbooks in the future and how I would use the white paper one as well. So I do like to layer things. You can see that things went over the pan pastel fine, but just coming back to that, I think that the colour is the biggest difference there. So the smoothness does apply absolutely fine. I find that the blending is good as well. It's completely smooth, this paper, so there's no texture or roughness. So I think that pan pastels work really well in here, but the colours do change from sitting on the ivory to sitting on the white. I did keep the colour palette quite pastel-y. I really like these colours. It feels very peaceful, and I was really trying to capture the atmosphere of the scene. So I randomly dropped my pin up in Scotland and found these beautiful views. So they are in the similar area. You'll see when I move on to the white toned paper one that it's similar vibes, but I do change the colours up a little bit more and use more purple in the second piece. In terms of the paintbrush I'm using my beloved size 10, so I use this for most of my pieces. I really like that it has that sharper point if I want to add on small details like these leaves, but it's also perfect for creating the larger brushstrokes in the back that you can see where I've been a little bit looser. So I'm just adding on more leaves onto the trees. I'm doing this in kind of an abstract way. I really like the way that these were growing. I will leave a link to the Google Maps references down below if you wanted to tackle these as well. And here you can see I'm going over the pan pastels. I do get a lot of questions about whether I fix my work, so if I put anything on top to stop things smudging, especially with pan pastels, but I don't because I prefer not to use fixative in my sketchbooks. I find the smell can be a little bit too strong. The only time that I would use it was with oil pastels just because they are quite sticky. So I find that with pan pastels it smudges a little bit, it might fade, but you can still tell that there's it doesn't take it off completely. It still keeps the pan pastel on the page, and I just use scraps of paper in between my pages, so if any of the pigment does smudge off when I'm working on the other side, it will go onto the scrap paper rather than the other side of the art. And I keep about 5 or 6 of these pieces of scrap paper in my pages, and then I move them along the sketchbook as I work through it. So the whole sketchbook isn't filled with scrap papers between each pages, because then it would get too thick and a little bit hard to use. So just a few that I move forward as I work through the sketchbook, and then I find that works really well because the pressure only affects recent pages, so towards the beginning of the sketchbook I find it's not an issue. So I hope that makes sense, but I just prefer not to fix my work, especially in my sketchbook when I'm using it so often. So everything has dried now. I actually moved on to the second piece whilst this was drying, so I've kept it in order of the pieces, just doing this sketchbook first, but I did leave it to dry, and now I'm coming in with my coloured pencil layer. I really enjoy building up textures like this at the moment. I discovered that from doing my texture month on Patreon, and I really enjoy adding in grassy textures, so I was just building those up there and adding on some more contrast. I will show you the final result of this one at the end of the video, so I'm going to show you both of the pieces together. But for now we're moving on to the white base version. So here's the cork outer cover. I really like the other ones because they come in so many different colours, but I've only seen this in the cork version like I said, so I do hope that they bring out more colours because I absolutely love the different variations that the Royal Talens come in. If I switched to white I definitely would miss that. So I'm applying gouache in the exact same way here, and this is the moment where I realised it was different. It does sink into the paper quite quickly, but I'm going to show you a close-up later on when I'm doing the final views where you can really see the texture is different. It kind of creates a sort of bubble effect, not in terms of texture, but in terms of the look. It's completely smooth, so it's not something that you can feel, but you can see that the gouache is sunk in a bit, and it's not as thickly applied as when I was putting it onto the ivory tone paper, even though I think I was doing it the same sort of thickness of gouache. I'll show you that a little bit later on so I can explain it a bit better, but here it wasn't an issue. It was only in the sky. I think maybe I was adding on a bit more water. You can see a little bit in the top left. It just creates that, it's kind of like it's been rained on, where it's got sort of the rings of the paint. But here it's been fine, so I think the thicker for this one the better. I'm going to talk about it at the end, but there definitely is a slight difference to this paper, and it was noticeable, but not enough for me to, change my process or change my technique. I'm still using and applying the gouache in the same way, so I have put some water onto it, but I do think it works better when it is thicker. Here you can really see the difference with the pan pastel, so it's a lot more vibrant and the colour is more rich. I also think that it's a bit more accurate to the shade that's in the pan pastel, so it does change the colour when I'm applying it on the ivory, and so it's more apparent here on the white. Again, I've dipped in my Dürer Inktense block, so I'm just applying that to the corner. I'm using the same sort of materials and the same application, but I'm just doing a different scene. I didn't want to do the exact scene twice, so I picked just a different view in the Scottish Highlands for this one. You'll see I also added on a few more purple tones and a few more orange tones as well, so I'm using the same mediums but not necessarily the exact same colours. And I think this one turned out really nicely. Again, I like the vibes. I really like the contrast of the purple with the green, and I think that shade of purple makes it feel very peaceful as well. I'm adding on some trees in the exact same way, so again I'm using a size 12 brush. This one is a different brand, but it's the same. It's just a little bit well loved, so it's a bit thicker and it doesn't have as much of a point. But it still allows me to be nice and loose and still put in some of these smaller areas of leaves as well. So I did find it interesting that I didn't have to come back to this and wait for it to dry. It dried a lot quicker, and I think again it's because it has sunk into the paper a lot more. I can still layer things on, so I'm using quite watery gouache here on top of the pan pastel, and it sinks really quickly into the page. After this I am going to show you some brush pen tests, because I thought that would be interesting to see if I could smudge it the same amount of time or how it sunk in. So that's going to be coming after this little test. It wasn't planned, but after creating these paintings I thought after actually using the paper it would be helpful to know. And like I said, I didn't have to wait for it to dry. The gouache does dry quite quickly. It definitely dried quicker in this piece than the other one. And I'm just coming in with my coloured pencil. So I do use a mix of Dürer Drawing and Caran d'Ache Luminance pencils, and also some Neocolours as well. I'm just trying to amp up some of the colours and adding in more texture. So it is quite subtle. I really tried not to overwork this, but I think just having those extra colours and building up the depth a little bit more really helped. So that's what I'm doing here, just adding in more pencils and coming in with some Neocolours as well. This was really helpful to add in a bit more like vibrancy in the colour, and then a few more details just to make things feel a little bit less loose. So I still try to find that balance between looseness and detail, and I think just smaller marks really help balance the larger brush strokes and make things feel a little bit more intentional. I'm coming in with my grassy texture that I mentioned that I really enjoy doing lately, and coming in with that darker tone really helps to create more contrast and make this feel more like a finished piece. It layers really nicely over the Dürer Inktense, which you can see here, and I think that really helps because it's matte, so I really like that effect. I don't use the Neocolours in here wet, I'm just using it dry. I think it would struggle if I was adding water because, like I said, it doesn't handle the water very well. So I'm just using those dry just to add on my usual pops of colour. So I'm just adding on final little touches, and then I'm going to show you the final pieces and the overview of how they turned out. So you can see the difference here with the ivory toned and the white toned. It's definitely very apparent, and you can see the two final pieces. I'm going to show you some close-ups, so I'm going to pan over the spread so you can see all the different textures and the different colours, and I really like how they turned out. I think it was a really helpful exercise. Here is the white one, so from afar you really can't tell a difference. You can see that I've still got my brush strokes, but this is where you can see the sky, so you can see that texture and it's really sunk into the page, which was very interesting. But overall, and like I said, from afar you really wouldn't know. Here I'm turning the pages so you can see if it's buckled at the back. There is obviously a slight texture on both. A little bit more on this white version, you can see it's warped the paper a little bit, but overall it's very similar. So like I said, I did want to do a brush pen test, so I'm using some Faber, Castell, Albrecht, Dürer watercolour markers. That's the colour earth green that I'm using here, and also some Tombos and then some eco lines. So I placed down the colour and then straight away tried to smudge it. It was very similar. I do think that it smudged a bit more from the ivory toned than it did on the white, so there was a little bit more time. But I was really interested to see how they layer, and I think you do have to be careful in the Royal Talens anyway, but the white one definitely struggled more. It was pilling the paper more and picking up more of that sort of paper pigment. I will show you some close-ups at the end, but here's a Neocolor 2 pastel going down, and then I do add water to it, and it works quite well actually. It worked better than I thought. I do think that the white paper is more absorbent, so you can see here where the pilling is more apparent on the white toned paper, and overall it does seem very similar, but I do think that it sunk more into the white paper. I think that is definitely more absorbent than the ivory. Okay, so I found that really interesting. I definitely personally prefer the piece of art I did on the ivory toned paper, but I still really like the white toned one, which obviously you've just seen and looks like this. Now, in terms of the way that it handles, obviously I talked a little bit about this in the voiceover, but it's pretty similar. I wouldn't say that I would never buy this because it's not the same. I would buy the white toned paper again and I would recommend it, but it's not exactly the same. There is a slight difference. I do think that the white paper is a little bit more absorbent. I think that Royal Talens in general is an absorbent paper, but I think that there's a little bit less time to be able to smudge things. I think it goes straight into the white paper. It did pill a bit more with the brush pens, and most interestingly, I found that the texture that was made on top, which you can see here from the gouache, is very different. I've never seen that on the ivory based paper, and I have done a lot of sketchbooks. I don't know if you can see them, but there's a whole stack behind me and I've never seen that happen. So there's definitely a difference, but it's not huge or really, really noticeable. I think if you are using mixed media, I think that it does hold things pretty well. Again, I wouldn't use watercolour in it, just like I wouldn't recommend it for the ivory toned paper. So I would say that it's not like a huge difference in terms of different paper weight or really struggling or like really pilling the paper immediately, or that I can't use the usual materials I do in this new sketchbook. So for me, I still would buy it again. I do like the white tone paper. It makes a big difference with the colours. I think it feels very different just because it is such a different tone, but I would still use this as like an everyday carry, and I would definitely look at buying them again in the future. The ivory toned is definitely like a safe place for me. I feel really attached to those sketchbooks, so we will see. But I'm looking forward to doing more tests in this sketchbook as I go through. So probably after I finish this lilac one, I'll move into this one and create in here more regularly. If you do want me to test out specific mediums in the new white based paper, do let me know in the comments and I'll be happy to do that for you as well. So I hope that was helpful. They are still very similar, but there is definitely a slight difference. A huge thank you to my patrons for their support. I'm taking April off of Patreon, so if you're seeing this on the day it goes out, this is the last day you can join if you wanted to come into the Patreon until I reopen the doors again in May. So a big thank you for their support because it means I can create this free content, and a huge thank you to you for watching and following me here on YouTube. Like I said, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the comments, and if you've tried these out yourself, I'd love to know your thoughts too. I hope you have a creative week ahead, and I will see you next week with a new YouTube video. See you later.